you do just see these programs come through and cost tens of millions of dollars instead of $1 billion.
Yeah, totally. So I think the $1 billion number is often referenced for like a blockbuster program for US and European populations.
Yeah.
When you're talking about a public health drug or vaccine, it ranges by literally an order of magnitude.
Of course. Only one?
Yeah, only one, I think. No, it could be two. And that's why it seems almost silly to say these numbers, because they really can range. And I've been a part of trials that are in these ranges. As you've talked about before in other conversations, it's critical to kind of engage the entrepreneurial and biotech ecosystem to develop drugs. The vast majority of drugs ever developed have been done by companies and launched. And so this kind of allows for companies to take on these neglected drugs with the promise of this kind of potentially $100 million on the other side. Maybe this becomes a less unipolar global health research and development world. And so I think just as a public health person, I like more minds on task and more dollars going towards drug development as a physician and as someone who wants fewer kids to die.
Welcome back to Development and Research, where we talk about doing things differently in the world of clinical trials and drug development. I'm here with Charlie Petty, who runs an investment firm that focuses in an area that is widely considered more suitable for charity work than investment. So, welcome, Charlie.
Thanks for having me. Excited to do this.
But let's get into that sort of contradiction or oddity from the top. Why is infectious disease considered a commercially difficult area? And what is different about your thesis on any of this?
Yeah, I think there's like a dozen ways to answer that. I think like one way of thinking about it is the end markets and who gets infectious diseases most often, where is the highest mortality and morbidity from infectious disease, and it's in the developing world. It's people who cannot pay for medicine and systems where there are not industrialized large-scale healthcare delivery systems like we have in the US and Europe. The other way of thinking about it is in terms of just like a kind of emergent nature of the world, which is that when you want to take care of an infectious disease, for the most part, you can cure it by killing the bug. There are exceptions to that, like in HIV, where we haven't figured out how to do that yet. But hepatitis C is a good example of, a single regimen of antivirals can clears the disease forever. That's on the treatment side.
Not with 100% probability, but enough of this. But this is the normal case.
It's kind of one and done.
Yeah.
On the flip side of that, you have vaccines on the prevention side, where in some cases, infant and childhood immunizations, it's kind of one and done. Maybe you get a booster every 10 years. Flu, COVID, and a couple of other examples may happen annually, but it's really kind of a one-time experience with the drug.
And the economics of that on the commercial side, on a vaccine, these things between the people who are actually paying cost $25 in the ballpark?
Yeah, this is a good question. So historically, they've been in a very kind of low single digit, dollars to tens of dollars range, depending on what market you're talking about. In the emerging markets, it's,
when we're shipping these to Africa, they're $2, $4, whatever.
Flu vaccines are in the kind of $20 to $30 range.
In US reimbursement.
In the US reimbursement world. And the way reimbursement works here, just assume that it's CMS, Medicare, Medicaid kind of setting prices.
Sure.
And insurance companies mostly following suit. Flu is this whole weird other ball game because we procure some of it ourselves. We approve new vaccines annually.
And this rolling schedule of it comes up every year. There's a new version, new product
based on the circulating strain in the southern hemisphere. So there's a little bit of a weird dynamic there.
But for the one and dones there.
But for the one and dones, it's in that range. That said, there are next generation flu vaccines that are either have more antigens, so more dose, or have an adjuvant. Those are used for people who have compromised immune systems or older or immune senescent, so their immune systems are less responsive to vaccines. Those can kind of be in the $60 to $90 range. And so those are kind of the start of the premium vaccines. In the past 15 years, we've had a number of approvals for premium vaccines that are either kind of next generation vaccines, both from a modality standpoint in terms of like the technology that's used, but also from diseases that previously did not have kind of like first gen vaccines. So the examples here are like Shingrix for shingles, which is varicella zoster virus. The other would be Gardasil for HPV and HPV associated cancers. And so a full course of those, depending on the region, but let's say US and Europe, are in the hundreds of dollars. So it's Gardasil is 3-dose regimen today. The total package there is in the the mid hundreds of dollars. So that's kind of interesting and exciting for my world that, it seems like the market is willing to pay for some of these premium vaccines, especially where the sequelae associated with the kind of underlying virus is related to chronic conditions, or in the case of HPV, cancers.
Things that get very expensive.
And so there's the public health math on these make a lot of sense.
Yep.
As opposed to it would be hard to say that influenza is a nuisance because it kills 40,000 people a year.
Right.
But it's not seen it's seen as this kind of old school public health, low cost, that kind of like the norms have been established there. We can make these vaccines very cheaply.
Yep.
Whereas something that can prevent a previously untreatable or difficult to treat cancer is just an amazing innovation, and we're willing to pay slightly more for that. Still, a vaccine.
You're excited. You're excited when the market's willing to bear $80 for a vaccine that's solving $800 of problem. None of this holds a candle to what the U.S. spends on its expensive healthcare spending.
Yeah,
which is chronic disease management, oncology, and age-related conditions. People there are spending tens of thousands of dollars into the six figures a year on.
Exactly. So I think it's important to talk about, when we're talking about R&D and public health in general, is that in the U.S. anyway, drugs are like 10 to 15% of total spend, depending on how you count it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at people talk about this $4 trillion or this multi-trillion-dollar healthcare industry we have, or healthcare spend, hundreds of billions of dollars are going to drugs. And that's everything from vaccines to small molecule pills, chemotherapy drugs, gene therapy. So like across the gamut, three big buckets you could say is like end of life care, ton of that going on in the hospital, all sorts of drugs. Oncology, which, there's tons of different types of oncology drugs. But if you're talking about chemotherapy, sometimes these can be long, and surgeries. These are very long durations of care, and they just add up over time. And you can kind of comment on the efficiency of certain types of oncology interventions. But putting that aside, very expensive. And then chronic, as you mentioned, these antibodies that are used often for like autoimmune conditions are in the tens of thousands of dollars per year per patient, kind of in perpetuity. And if you get diagnosed with something like ulcerative colitis or psoriasis or something in your mid 30s, these drugs you use for the rest of your life, or at least many decades. And so, the kind of burden is just enormous on that side. And it's actually just so much more than the kind of expensive gene therapy numbers you see, like Zolgensma and others with these kind of eye-watering price tags.
For a one-time course.
Don't actually make up today a huge portion of healthcare spend, and definitely not of drug spend.
Okay, so with that as the baseline, that these are the things that are difficult. The market is not willing to bear high costs, even when the burden in mortality numbers on a global scale is steep because of the one-time versus chronic nature. All of this is commercial headwinds. Where does GHIC come into this? And then sort of how do you see the opportunity in this landscape?
Yeah, so we're a 10-year-old mission-driven investment manager, originally formed by the Gates Foundation and JP Morgan, to try to figure out if you can have sustainable investing strategies in the global public health domain. It takes a bunch of different flavors for us, but the core strategy is in venture. We do a couple different things. One thing is investing in vaccine companies where there's a really attractive target, like the Shingrix and Gardasil examples that I mentioned earlier. And there's a pipeline of products that could be used for global health that use the same technology platform.
So just so I understand that correctly, there's a U.S. market for something like the HPV vaccine, but once that technology is developed, it'll be able to be repurposed or sort of added on for any number of diseases that maybe don't have markets that would have borne the whole cost of development. Is that right?
Yeah, HPV is a tricky one because it's a blockbuster vaccine, but it is also a big problem globally. So just as a single asset, Gardasil or similar products are important public health tools. I think a good example of a platform technology that was used for a commercial indication and then ultimately used for global public health would be mRNA. At the outset, Moderna was not focused on pandemic vaccine, but the fact that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing initially cancer vaccines and then vaccines for latent viral infections, provided the world with this kind of endowment technology that could be repurposed for a pandemic. The other is just, like if you look at kind of an upstart company developing a vaccine, let's say a Shingrix competitor or a next generation Shingrix, we're invested in a company that's doing this. Their core platform is basically the design of this protein antigen, but also this novel adjuvant is in short supply, or the kind of analog of this adjuvant is in short supply because it requires a novel natural products input. And so this company has been able to make that adjuvant synthetically.
Yep.
And so that adjuvant can now be applied to
any other allergen that works well with it.
And so this company has a pipeline of other potential vaccines
Yep.
or may license the adjuvant to another provider. So I think, yeah, that's one way of thinking about it, is what can this thing do besides what the kind of flagship example of the product is. And then there's like a couple of other options. We've talked about priority review vouchers in the past. As one concept, stockpiles, so global health and national stockpiles are a way of creating a market where there is otherwise.
How big is that total addressable market in pharmaceutical stockpiles?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it ranges widely depending on what you mean. The strategic national stockpile
In the US.
in the US, which is kind of this US managed thing jointly between a couple of agencies, has, masks and respirators and antivirals and tools to address kind of traditional kinetic warfare. So it's like this whole, imagine like a radiological event, a nuclear event, a chemical attack. So it's kind of all in this one bucket. The kind of assets, it's not totally public, like what it all goes into it, but it's in the kind of like hundreds of millions per year of resupply. And a lot of that is kind of planned purchases for things like influenza vaccines for pandemic, replacing out-of-date respirators that kind of came offline. And so some of this is available online, but it's not a huge market.
I mean, that's niche on the scale of a single blockbuster drug that's hitting a more commercial market.
Yeah, correct. But I think for non-traditional biopharma companies that are developing a medical countermeasure, you can imagine a small startup that has gotten a product to phase 2, getting a purchase order for several $100 million of your product can make a big difference.
Sure.
I think especially if you're talking about drugs that don't require a phase 3 trial. So for medical countermeasures where there are no traditional peacetime use cases, a lot of these companies are very small. They also don't need to run phase 3 trials in many cases because you just need to demonstrate safety. You can't do a challenge trial in humans with something like anthrax or Ebola. And so for kind of a little bit of development costs, you can get a product that could be stockpiled. So that there's some companies that kind of specialize in that type of medical countermeasure development. There's also the UNICEF stockpile. So UNICEF, for example, has a cholera vaccine stockpile. The UNICEF
where that's for outbreaks, not national security threats.
Totally different, idea. Outbreaks following a similar paradigm where there is not enough business to generate for a cholera company. In fact, there's only kind of one left in the world. We invested in it in our first fund because there's kind of like a maybe 50 to 150, depending on the year, million market for cholera in that space. And that's not enough to sustain a company. And so you're essentially signaling to the market that there's this ongoing demand. It's not quite a prize, not quite an advanced market commitment, not quite a guarantee of supply, but something in the middle because you're getting kind of every couple of years refresh of the stockpile that's drawn down. But this is not something that you can build large biotech companies around. But you're not going to build the next Genentech out of stockpile selling. It's just the TAM isn't big enough.
The other possible angle on this that you mentioned and we blew past, I want to return to, you said priority review vouchers. How does that program work, and how does that look from where you sit as an investor or as a potential investor?
Yeah, so it's a funky program that not a lot of people outside of the industry know about. It actually came out of a paper from Duke, from a guy named David Ridley in the mid-2000s to propose a novel incentive design mechanism that basically allows the developers of a drug for a neglected tropical disease or for a rare disease, so for areas where a lot of commercial funding is not available.
And it's been decided that it's a policy priority of some sort.
Yeah, so there's actually a list in the legislation that created the priority review voucher. There's a list of neglected tropical diseases. Some have been added over time, especially as the list has been whittled down. But the long and short of it is, if you were to develop a drug for this category, you get a shorter review
on that drug.
So this review gets put into the kind of fast pile. Let's say a typical FDA review is in the 10 months range. It becomes something like 4 to 6 months. And you might say, well, why does that matter for a drug that has no commercial value? Well, it's because not only is your drug reviewed faster, you also get a voucher that you could use for another drug to use faster. And that doesn't matter so much for if you're a vaccine company and you want another vaccine to be reviewed faster. But what if you took that and took it to Novartis and sold it to them? Because Novartis has a very different problem on their hands. They're racing 5 or 6 other companies to get into blockbuster areas, drugs that sell in the billions of dollars.
In heart disease or cancer or
in other areas.
recently it's been obesity, right? I think obesity, these are headbirds were soaked up by the obesity companies coming with their new.
Totally, exactly. So it's kind of just NPV math, and it's also first to the market math. So getting 6 months of review time or 4 months of review time chopped off.
How much is that worth for the biggest companies?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the ranges have been, I think, in the kind of $50 to $350 million range.
Huh?
The median has been sold, basically $100 million is where the market has decided these things trade.
Sure.
Not all of them are public, how much they've been traded, all the transactions, but
I think an investor, that's what you'd think about it.
That's what I think of the notional value of a PRV in the market. And neglected tropical disease in this category is, we invested in a PRV program for river blindness, which is a parasitic disease that infects very, very poor people in a very specific region in Central and West Africa. And, there's just no commercial market for this.
Yeah.
The current...
You're selling to 8 programs.
It's funny, ivermectin is actually the current standard of care, but that's basically donated, as I understand it, by Merck.
Yeah.
And so there's really no market.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of diseases like this that matter a lot. Soil transmitted helminths, other kind of nasty and horrible things that you don't want children to get. And there's just no commercial market to make these. And so you have on the push side, people like, groups like the Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust funding the research and development often early. And then on the pull side, you have the potential for profit for those who develop these drugs. And it's, as you've talked about before in other conversations, it's critical to kind of engage the entrepreneurial and biotech ecosystem to develop drugs. The vast majority of drugs ever developed have been done by companies and launched. And so this kind of allows for companies, mostly in the later stage, so kind of phase 1, let's say forward, to take on these neglected drugs with the promise of this kind of potentially $100 million on the other side. And so, it's a pretty cool program. There's there are
a few other policy priorities that get snuck in, or as it gets reauthorized and reappropriated, other things fall into or out of the program over time.
Yep. Yeah. So it's kind of all wonky in terms of how Congress approved these, but the original NTD one is kind of most enshrined, and then there's a rare pediatric one also similarly enshrined. There was, for several years, one for medical countermeasures, so for pandemic preparedness and other medical countermeasures, that sunset late last year and is kind of working its way through various reauthorization bills. So there is this risk in this space that, you're kind of at the whim of Congress. I think, though, it's interesting in that it doesn't require Congress to pay for anything. You're not asking taxpayers to pay for this.
Yep.
And I think in today's political climate and for the past 10 years, frankly, finding a solution that's kind of like appears to be kind of Pareto optimal and is getting something done that otherwise wouldn't have been done is pretty cool without taxpayer dollars going into it.
Yeah.
And on the margins, the FDA, I think they view it as kind of a really interesting, impactful thing they do. And are kind of happy to do it themselves.
To get at these causes.
Yeah, it's a cool thing. I think a lot of people, most people work at the FDA are very mission driven, and they could be doing something else and making more money. And so we've had really positive interactions with kind of regulators and government on this side of things to get these programs done.
Yeah. So when you're impact driven, but you're looking out of the venture world, looking for these things which make a commercial case on the investment side, they're also pointing in the same direction as your mission. Can you just find $100 million of investable opportunities there? Do you have to go out and make your own opportunities, or are you shaping this market around over the 10 years that you've been at it?
Kind of all of the above. We've tried to establish ourselves as leaders in global public health investing. We do this through a number of means. We talk to foundations who are funding early stage programs. We talk to the government, who in many cases are funding similar early stage programs in academia or at nonprofits. We try to network with other VCs and pharma companies. They're usually very excited to work with us because, they often come across deals that they're excited about personally, don't know what to do with.
Sure.
And so anytime a vaccine comes across their desk at, one of these venture firms, we often get a call, which we want. We want to be kind of the first port of call for VCs who are investing in infectious disease and public health broadly. We've looked at kind of bringing some things out of pharma a number of times and have supported, not so much us doing it, but supporting companies pulling things out of pharma. And that's kind of, like you said, kind of creating the opportunity, where a company is discharging its infectious disease program or winding down a specific vaccine program. You can go to them and say, hey, what if I gave you X million dollars to buy it? We can split the economics if things work out. And so that's one way of doing it. Yeah, so I mean, we have to be pretty scrappy, right? We're not just sitting here getting pitched by by entrepreneurs all day. Although I think there are a surprising number of people pursuing really important public health products in the form of companies, and so it's a mix of just kind of inbound and us hustling. We go to a lot of conferences where we're the only VCs there, so. I was very pleased that at World Vaccine Congress this year there were two other venture firms, which kind of often isn't the case. We go to a conference called the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturing Network, which is really around production of vaccines in emerging markets.
Yep.
So you have,
but that really does sound like the venture event of the year. The developing countries vaccine.
Yeah, exactly. I was in 2018. I was in Kunming, China, with all of the leaders. Really fascinating how some of these developing country vaccine manufacturers came to be. Many of them were public-private partnerships or fully government-owned under previous governments, have then either been privatized or the other way around, depending on how it happened. And so you have these really fascinating people who've been working in these kind of pharma-adjacent vaccine manufacturing companies for years, who just know more than anyone in the world about how to make large-scale, super cheap vaccines. And they're often the partners we want to take the vaccines we invest in that are developed in Silicon Valley or in Kendall Square. Ultimately, we want these vaccines to be made available globally. And so we'll take the IP or have our companies partner with a developing country vaccine manufacturer to actually do it. So we're kind of all over the place and in a lot of places that traditional VCs don't spend a lot of time.
So perhaps taking a slice of this on a slightly different axis, how does your portfolio tend to break down on shiny, new, cutting-edge tech versus low scientific risk applications of proven platforms into new areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we probably see 50-50 and action like 80-20 in the direction of shiny new things, more shiny new things, and 20 to 30% are in the kind of special situations bucket. And that's largely
something which is scientifically boring, but the deal's got hair and it's something sweet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're kind of playing in an interesting part of the world where there's, let's say 1 to 5 fancy vaccine companies that launch a year, backed by top tier VCs or pharma companies. And then there are dozens of other kind of poorly funded academic spinouts that have been around for a decade, often run by the PI or a friend of the PI that have been surviving on grants. And like those are just tricky situations as any investor. And so we try to find the best ones of those and kind of help form financing for, do some capital formation around them, help with talent, et cetera. But there just are fewer of those that we view as investable. And so, something we like doing and have done historically is like you find a great team that's developing their own vaccine candidate and you come across some interesting technology in academia. You can kind of license that product into the kind of competent, well-funded management team's portfolio. And that's like a nice thing we'd like to do more of, but it just requires a heavy lift. And it's a lot harder than just kind of saying yes to an investment that...
That is pretty high-touch work and not... work that you're making for yourself.
And we're happy to roll up our sleeves and do that. But so kind of a little bit of both.
And maybe this is treading over the same ground. But if I put my effective altruist hat on and say, okay, I'm investing in this company, in this initiative, am I causing this to exist where it wouldn't already? Or am I just along for the ride and like I'm the one who's seeing the profits instead of wherever in capital markets this elsewhere would have come from? So how much of the credit do you get as the investor in a moral sense? And
we go down. I mean, you wouldn't imagine the conversations we have about causality and counterfactual impact at the firm. But so I tend to think there's a wide range, right? So in some cases, we are piggybacking on a project that was already going to happen. We're participating. Money is fungible. Someone else would have written that check. And we like to think on those, the kind of counterfactual impact we're having is typically around access and not so much about the project happening.
Say more about access.
So just think about a vaccine company that's being launched by a top tier venture firm. Often, we haven't talked about this before, but often what we'll do is we'll come in, we'll get on the board. We also have a side letter that we sign with the company that obligates the company to do a number of things. One of those things could be create a development plan. The other could be as far as register this product in X number of countries within the first 5 years of commercial launch. Another could be launch the product in those companies and charge COGS plus 50%, which is 99% less than you would charge in the US. So we have a couple of tools where just our involvement is quite counterfactually impactful, not from the kind of yes, no, this thing exists or not, but more from a how fast this product gets into the developing world. That's more for our global health investments where we're really interested in access and getting products out there as soon as possible. Less so for the kind of cutting edge technology where the product is 10 or 15 years away. It's just harder to kind of see through the future as to what is going to matter from a kind of an impact standpoint and how you would structure agreements. And then I think there are, and that I would say that's in that kind of 50 to 80%, vaccine deals that are getting done by traditional VCs bucket. In the kind of special situations bucket, let's call it, those feel very counterfactually impactful because, oftentimes these are assets that are actually being wound down or shut down or are neglected in some other way and are not being developed. And so we're kind of picking something up and advancing it, and it's been sitting there on the ground for a while. And so I think for those, we give ourselves quite a bit of credit. There's a ton of other examples. We've done medical devices before, and in those cases, we will obligate the companies to develop lower cost versions of those devices or reusable versions of those devices, or, for example, port a diagnostic test into a cheaper platform, or like lower the cost through other design changes. So
make it more suitable for delivery into
the markets we care about, which is global health, but emerging markets in particular. So I think it's kind of investment by investment. It can range. Sometimes it really was us being a part of the team to get something done. And in other cases, it's like we're making something 20% better. And I'm like very happy to make things 20% better as well.
20% of a big number is a big number.
20% of a big impact. Yeah, exactly. If you think about getting a vaccine that will vaccinate hundreds of millions of people
1 year sooner,
or cheaper, or having just the N be larger, it really, the numbers add up quite a bit.
So when you're approaching a company on sort of these lines where you want them to have an global access program for emerging markets, commercially, it's just kind of a shrug. Like that's not going to cost them anything. That's not going to make them anything. Is convincing companies to go ahead with that like pulling teeth? It's like, it is going to be a headache. Or are these largely things that they wanted to do already and you're kind of holding their hand, giving them an excuse? What's the spread there?
Yeah, it's like all over the place. So I think it really depends. There's some companies that want to do this already and they need funding or they need an excuse to do it. And our involvement is an excuse. If it's really not a commercial activity, it's hard to, as a fiduciary, we really can't ask our companies to do these things. And so typically what we're doing is we're building a business case for the emerging market or for the neglected area. We're working with potential non-dilutive funders who could fund the development of these programs. And so you could imagine a specific vaccine program within a company we really like. There just are not equity dollars to fund that program. We'll work with one of our foundation partners, or we'll bring in a foundation specific to that disease to fund that work. And maybe some of our equity dollars goes towards it. So that's kind of one version of it. I think other versions are, especially in the special situations bucket, like, we are the lender of last resort. And in that case, we have just a lot more leverage to say, hey, it's really important to us that you're going to make this product and you might make a lot of money off of PRV, but we want it to be accessible. And so part of the agreement we're going to get to here is like, how are you going to get this out there? We want a very concrete plan for that. And then some other, investments like don't really require this. And so for pandemic influenza vaccines or other products where they're just kind of inherently good to be out there in the world and stockpiled, we're just like very aligned with the companies in developing those. And we don't really need to ask them to do anything different. So each one is bespoke and like highly dependent on the circumstances. But in general, I think it's just like in life, but in general, it's very hard to get people to do things they don't want to do. And so almost in no cases are we coming to a company that like vehemently does not want to do this thing, and
they just need your money.
They just need our money, and we are going to create a Byzantine legal structure to force them to do something. Just as a career investor, like I've never had anything work out like that. So I think our bias is like finding teams that are really excited about this and excited about this partnership. And oftentimes we're one of the smaller checks or the smaller institutional checks in a company, and we get tons of face time with the companies. We spend a lot of time with them, and I think it's board seat and all that. I think that's largely because, like I said earlier, like most people are in the business to improve the world. Like there are exceptions, but if you're the CEO of a scrappy biotech company, you could be doing many different things. You're a smart person, presumably have a PhD in the life sciences. And I would say, most of the people we interact with are pretty great and doing what they're doing for, I think, very noble reasons.
But here you are one of the few players in the capital markets on the provider side. who maybe has that streak and is speaking to that motivation of why the founders are there and doing what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of reasons why that could be. I mean, part of it came from, I think, just willpower 10, 15 years ago from folks at the Gates Foundation and JP Morgan and other groups that helped kind of form GHIC, mostly driven by big personalities like Bill, which I think is just sometimes great and important to get things done in the world.
Yeah.
And I think another one is, we've kind of chosen a strategy around what we think will actually work. So I don't think what we do will work or works well, just kind of empirically, in domains where you don't have this like very, very robust adjacent commercial engine in pharmaceutical development. And so even in healthcare, there have been a bunch of funds launched around digital health or med tech or kind of patient access or physical infrastructure. And it's just been really hard to do because, I think in our area, we just benefit so much from this engine of intellectual property generation that is the US and other biotech ecosystems, and we kind of draft off the risk of this.
This is the academic university network. This is NIH funding, NSF.
Yeah,
all of that's feeding in.
Yeah, it's just this like endowment that we benefit from, and so I think it's just hard to do outside of this like superpower research and development kind of industrial complex we have here in the US.
These sort of apps don't come quarter baked out of a university.
Yeah, totally. I think we're just very lucky to have that.
So one conversation that we keep returning to on this podcast is what is going on with the cost of developing new drugs, the timelines of that, and some of the trends here are looking pretty ugly over time. Does that show up in your world, in the public health? Yes. You're not being spared in this.
Yeah, no. I think we're kind of in it with everyone else. I think in some ways we're privileged in that, the regulators in general, they want more public health products out in the world. I think where there may be some pushback is around areas where they view kind of marginal improvements to drugs that are kind of not generating significant patient impact. You see this, I think, in oncology. You see this in the autoimmune space, the I&I space now.
That are happening to create a on-patent drug at a much higher price point than whatever was generic around.
So, exactly. So I think my sense is that there's just like some general pushback around the deluge of drugs for
within the agency of this like
that's like
drug faster version.
And so just from a like tension and kind of pushback standpoint, maybe you're seeing some of that. I think there's just like goalpost shifting in terms of like what we're even trying to do here on an indication by indication area. And so, I think there's like a huge conflict. If you look at what's gone on in like Alzheimer's, if you look at like DMD, if you look at some of the gene therapy programs, I think, without getting too political, there are people in the FDA who care a lot about certain modalities. There's huge pressure from industry in certain other areas. There's huge pressure from industry groups and from patient groups in other areas. And that just creates this like complicated mess. But I do think there's just like structural things, like the FDA, in my view, is kind of like under-resourced and probably could benefit more from like technology and just like straight up resourcing in terms of human capital, which is kind of the limiting factor for drug development. I think we've just are beneficiaries of the agency caring a lot about public health.
Sure.
And, for us, what matters is not just the FDA, but also like the CDC and ACIP, the groups that actually recommend how vaccines and drugs are used.
Sure.
And so
it's not enough for it to be approved.
It has to be, recommended for a specific patient population. Yeah. And so I think in general,
that's true in the US. There's parallel institutions that would be for abroad and
exactly. Like EU has similar programs.
Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a lot you could say about the FDA broadly, but in our investment area, I think we are often met with a very constructive regulator.
Okay.
Which I think a lot of people in other areas would not agree with.
So if the costs are ratcheting up over time and the stuff is getting harder and more expensive to do, but it's not coming from what pushback at the regulatory level, where does that come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of it has to do with just like take vaccines, for example. The bar for safety, I think, is appropriately very high and getting higher over time.
Sure.
And so,
but maybe had been lower, which is why the costs are now higher than they've been.
Yeah, certainly. If you think about drugs that were approved or kind of, 50 or 30 years ago, we're just in a different kind of paradigm. And some of these vaccines we're still using today. And so the kind of size of the
polio vaccine would never be approved today.
Or would just have a ridiculously different IND package and BLA filing. I think there's like the safety element and wanting like bigger trials, wanting more things to be done to demonstrate safety and to demonstrate efficacy.
What are the numbers on that?
Yeah.
And how much of that trial is realistically getting at the safety side versus the efficacy side?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it differs by modality. But if you look at like vaccines, like you're dosing healthy people, you're giving this to healthy people. It's a product for healthy people. For a totally novel vaccine, you're talking about 10,000 plus patients, largely, and it depends on what the kind of construct is, but like thousands to show efficacy and thousands to show safety. And a huge caveat here is it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you're just trying to show some biomarker that is equivalent to something we know is protective for a certain disease, the numbers can be much lower.
You can show that people are developing the antibodies.
You can show people are developing the antibodies. We know this antibody is protective, especially for kind of fast follower vaccines or follow-on vaccines, where it's the second or third, like improved version of a vaccine. For field efficacy trials in a new vaccine, I mean, if you think about like the Gardasil program or the Shingrix program, like you needed to go out and vaccinate tens of thousands of people and hope that like the attack rate math in terms of like how many people in your control group and how many people in your active group are going to get shingles, and those numbers just get super big because at like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% recurrence rates for shingles, it's just a very hard. The numbers are the numbers, and so I think for certain disease areas, obviously in oncology, it's very hard to find patients and treat them for totally other reasons. But it's not because the numbers are big; it's because you need to recruit this subsection slice of a patient population, go find them, and then pay $100,000 to a tier 1 kind of cancer hospital to do the trial. In vaccines, it's like we got to find 10,000 people to do this study. Ideally,
and no one's getting $100,000 of medical care.
No one's. It's not. You're getting right. So the incentives are weird. You have to sign up dozens of trials dozens of clinical trial sites in the U.S., Europe, Asia. There's a whole comment around where you do the trials. But in the US, you're trying to go hospital to hospital or clinician to clinician and get them to sign up for your trial.
Sure.
Most large pharma companies and the CROs, the clinical research organizations, have vaccine trial networks. So some of this exists, but it's just not cheap to recruit thousands of Americans to get a shot.
Sure.
I
mean, what does that cost?
Yeah.
Can we get into this in a little bit of the nitty-gritty?
Yeah, get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty. Like, there's people throwing numbers for oncology trials in the like
$100,000 a patient,
which is, we're not in that zone for our world. I would say in like US vaccine world, like the $5,000 to $20,000 a patient seems possible, with tons of caveats around what the vaccine is.
Cost all told, or that's recruitment?
That is cost all told per patient.
Sure.
Not including getting into vaccine manufacturing is a whole other conversation around how complicated that is.
Sure.
But, it depends on the modality. But if you're using a recombinant protein vaccine, you are with usually cells growing these proteins, harvesting them, filtering them, making sure they're safe, often putting them with an adjuvant, vialing them, the whole thing. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars, even for a phase 1. So
even for a 20-patient trial.
Even for a 20-patient trial. I mean, it's almost like, the incremental patient from a CMC context is trivial. It's the kind of classic upfront cost problem. So, that's kind of an all-in cost with tons of caveats around how big the safety kind of database for if you're going to do a novel adjuvant. There's a very high bar for safety. You might have to do a separate study of just safety for the adjuvant. And depending on the size of the trial. So, I think there are efforts in global health to lower these costs, and doing trials outside the US saves a lot of money. But if you're in a flagship US trial, you're talking still thousands and thousands of dollars per patient.
Sure.
And then a company, a company that's operating a phase 2 clinical trial is also burning tens of millions of dollars a year in kind of overhead. And so when people talk about
where's that going?
This is, it's a sub 100 person company, but you have a regulatory affairs team, you have a CMC team. The clinical research team they're
doing these in-house. That's the team that's contracting it out.
Go on, you typically, the basic model for a biotech these days is like fairly outsourced and remote early on.
Yeah.
There's amazing clinical research organizations and CDMOs that do manufacturing, but as you go on, you have to bring more of that in-house.
Sure.
If you're developing a novel drug, you just need to have a team of people who understand how this drug is made internally. And that's, we're talking about 20 PhDs, in San Francisco or Boston. It's very expensive. Regulatory affairs, medical affairs, putting together the papers, just processing the data from a clinical trial is just, even after you get it from the CRO, is an enormous ask. Regulatory affairs is like this art more than a science. And so you have to have the right regulatory affairs person and team, leadership. You need a CFO. Like, it really adds up.
Sure.
And so even for this
But you're burning tens of millions of dollars
just in
staff.
And offices and that sort of thing. And these are not extravagant operations. And so, yeah, it's like, it kind of adds up, and it, time is of the essence. And so the way biotech VC works is, you kind of fund in a single tranche to a milestone, and then you fund again.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of constantly in this race. While sometimes we want clinical trial costs to be lower, sometimes we want them to be higher and faster, because there are other costs that are kind of accruing that are not directly related to clinical trial that would kind of sink the company or have the company run out of money before the trial would be completed.
Yep.
And so you're in this kind of constant dance around quality, size, and speed, and kind of investor appetite, right? Because, if you were to come to me and say, hey, we found a way to make a vaccine trial where we recruit, patients are $1,000.
Yeah.
It's going to take us 15 years to recruit them, but you're going to save 90% on clinical trial recruitment.
Sure.
Doesn't work for obvious reasons. And so you're kind of always working with this like matrix of those issues. And speed matters a ton, right? Especially if you're kind of entering a market, as is often the case with 3 or 4 other products in development that are kind of plus or minus 1 year from you. 6 months, how much does 6 months cost? We know in kind of blockbuster big pharma world, $100 million from the PRV example. And so, yeah, it's kind of an interesting math problem, and one that we think about every day.
Oh, that's fun. I think I don't think of that frontier as, well, we can pay more money to get things to go faster. Sometimes that's the right lever to pull. And, just controlling costs is not the thing that matters to the impact. Or are these things going to
and you could argue in some cases, like getting faster, and especially in a pandemic, speed matters within cost, but a lot. In competitive markets like multiple GLP drugs getting the market, speed matters more than cost.
Yeah.
I think, though, in neglected tropical disease world, cost matters more than speed, right? Because speed matters, but it's a direct trade-off. And so, there's just, if you have kind of single-digit millions of dollars to run a phase 1, you really need to be scrupulous about how much that costs.
So there's this whole frontier of different options and different strategic choices here, but just to set levels, in the public health interventions, in the vaccines and in the non-vaccine countermeasures that you're looking at, what do those costs tend to look like?
Yeah, it ranges by literally an order of magnitude.
Of course. Only one?
Yeah, only one, I think. No, it could be 2. If I think about, so vaccines and therapeutics are just kind of different worlds.
Sure.
For the aforementioned reason.
Healthy people,
sick people, you can find the sick people easier often. But just like vaccines, where I spend a lot of my time, just to get to an IND, we're talking about like $10 to $30 million, let's say. And that is a huge generalization. There are companies that have spent hundreds of millions of dollars and still don't have an IND. Some of these large kind of platform companies. But if I think about a tactical, we have a RSV vaccine. Yeah, so let's say that's kind of to get to IND, and that's some CMC, animal trials, overhead, a bunch of assays that are kind of just like characterizing the product, and actually GMP manufacturing in advance of going into humans. So, are you using the manufacturing processes that are safe, that are kind of well controlled and safe? It's especially in biologics, vaccines, and antibodies. It's a whole world.
Yeah.
And then, to run a phase 1 trial, which really ranges in terms of how big that needs to be. Sometimes it's, tens of patients, sometimes it's hundreds of patients, but oftentimes it's in that kind of like 10 to 50 range. And you're just demonstrating safety. That can be
safety and mechanism and dynamics. Does it?
Yeah, safety. The primary, endpoint of the phase 1 is safety. You get some other things, but it's not a trial powered to do anything beyond.
Sure. Maybe we're going to measure some.
We're going to measure some biomarkers,
biological responses.
Yeah, exactly. Like in the case of a vaccine antibody response, even if that's not something that you could really, bet the farm on, you could say, okay, in 99% of our patients, we're seeing an X-fold increase in titers.
Essentially, either back to the drawing board or...
Yeah, and sometimes you'll even take multiple doses into the clinic. So 10, 50, and 100 milligrams or micrograms, 2 a day for an antibiotic versus 3 a day or once a week. There's so many different permutations. So phase 1 is really about safety, finding, kind of getting close to a dose. You usually down select to a dose or 1 to 2 doses for phase 2. So the phase 1 is in that kind of range. For the phase 2, it can range widely, even more widely, especially in terms of what you're trying to demonstrate, because oftentimes you can demonstrate efficacy in a phase 2 because a phase 2 can include, in some cases, patients who have the condition. If you're treating a condition, in some cases, you can get a correlative protection because you're chasing a vaccine that already exists on the market and you're trying to create a better one. In that case, you might make a larger phase 2 to demonstrate, hey, we actually are equivalent statistically to this marketed product. And so you may kind of pay up front for a larger phase 2 for those reasons. Again, if it's a novel product that has novel components the agency is worried about, it may have to be larger, again, from a safety standpoint. But let's say the phase 2 can be in the $50 to $150 million range. In neglected tropical disease, small molecule world, that number can be like an order of magnitude lower. You could do a $20 million phase 2.
What's changing in that step down?
I think it's like number of patients, CMC. So if you're looking at like a very high-end phase 2 vaccine trial for a potentially blockbuster vaccine, a big pharma company is going to spend a lot of money on that phase 2, have more patients, have more arms. If you're a scrappy nonprofit developing a NTD drug, you're going to do it with as few patients as possible and as few doses as possible and as few complexities as possible. I'm also saying all of these numbers in the context of like the developed world. These numbers are a lot different in the developing world.
The cost of delivering care, like every patient.
Service. So doing the trial can be much lower for patient recruitment. Delivering the care or delivering the placebo or doing the intervention. And that's why it seems almost silly to say these numbers because they really can range. And I've been a part of trials that are in these ranges. I mean, a 5 to 10 million phase 2 would be a really cheap phase 2, to be clear. You're often sometimes running multiple phase 2 trials. So like the entire phase 2 program is going to be in the tens of millions.
Oh, this is exploratory. We're trying to narrow in on when we set up for our final shot.
Yeah. And it's again, depending on what we're talking about, disease area, modality, approach, it's like narrowing in on the dose, narrowing in on the patient population. Hey, look at, this didn't work so well in this patient subpopulation, so we're going to take this to phase 2 or into phase 3. So there's a bunch of things you can kind of tweak in phase 2 still while you're developing your drug, your target product profile, dosing, et cetera. When you get to phase 3, what you're really bringing forward is the product that you want to market, and you want to study in the population you want to market it to. And those tend to be extremely large because you're powering them to show efficacy, safety and efficacy. And so, it depends on what we're talking about. But in rare disease world, you could have a phase 3 trial with one person in it. In vaccine world, you can have a phase 3 trial with 15,000 people in it. And when you're in the $15,000 patient bucket, you're just talking about up to hundreds of millions of dollars for a single phase 3 trial. And so it ranges widely, but the kind of canonical example of how much it costs a drug to bring to market is in like the $1 billion range. There's a bunch of fuzzy math as to if that includes failures earlier in the pipeline or if that's just direct costs. I think that's not an incorrect number that, hundreds of millions to $1 billion to develop a drug. These are really expensive programs, regardless of how you cut them. And kind of drives like, investment interest in the space entirely. It's, potential return relative to the costs and risks of getting these programs forward.
And you do just see these programs come through and cost tens of millions of dollars instead of $1 billion.
Yeah, totally. So I think the $1 billion number is often referenced for like a blockbuster program for US and European populations. When you're talking about a public health drug or vaccine, you're often running the trials in emerging markets where the kind of cost per patient is, even an order of magnitude lower. You're in areas often where the diseases are endemic and just like it's easier to find sick patients or the attack rates are much higher. Or, you're able to find populations that are untreated or don't have a vaccine. So if you're developing a new vaccine, there are populations that are vaccine naive.
The standard of care is...
And the whole thing, the standard of care is lower. So and I think it's like an interesting question around just like biopharma development in general. Should more trials be done ex-US? But for our world, a lot is done internationally.
Because you have to. Like you're because the blindness trial like is going to be done ex-US.
It has to be done ex-US. But I think there's also other interesting things like to save money. Australia has this amazing R&D tax credit program. So many of our companies have subsidiaries in Australia where you basically get a 40% or something tax credit from Australia for like doing research and development there. And as such, Australia has this like amazing public health R&D ecosystem.
Mhm.
So there are like lots of levers to pull on to lower costs. And you can do that on the manufacturing side. You can do that on the clinical trial side. And so, yeah, we're often talking to our companies about just these things.
Yeah.
How can we save money and make the cost of capital low enough to attract capital to bring these forward?
And consider your programs running outside of the US as one of the first tools you reach for in that toolbox.
Yes. Yeah. And you can only do that in a limited set of indications and programs, right?
Mhm.
But
Sorry.
yes.
Why? Like, what's limiting that?
Yeah, so I think it also depends on the phenotype of the company. So if we're coming into a company that's developing an STI vaccine for US markets,
Mhm.
that's funded by top VCs in the US,
Sure.
they're just not going to take our notes on making this trial less expensive in the developing world,
Uh-huh.
unless they've already thought of it as, unless it makes sense for their strategy.
Uh-huh.
I think when we're more in the
At the team level, the investor level?
yeah, kind of both. I mean, I think there's real like perception of, uncertainty and risk is like the death knell for investment in general.
Mhm.
And so like layering in, even if it's kind of vague, unspecified risk, which would be, can we really trust the data? How does the FDA view ex-US data? Like, how do we even think about this?
Yeah.
That alone is enough to kill interest in moving a program
Sure.
ex-US.
Just it being weird.
Yeah, just like a weirdness factor. Like no one ever got fired for hiring McKinsey or IBM. No one ever got fired for hiring a tier one CDMO and CRO in the
To
US.
do their trial in Boston.
Yeah, and if to be fair, if you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars of institutional LP capital or pharmaceutical budget capital, they're okay making this
On salary comp. If you're spending millions of dollars a year in salary comp and you propose cutting your trial's costs from 100 million to 20 million, doing something that's weird, like this often doesn't fly in the boardroom.
Totally. And I think there's the pharma industry, I think, is unfairly maligned in many ways, but like there's a real dynamic where, if a company is going and running a gene therapy trial in an emerging market, but has no plans to make that product available in the emerging market, I think that is like politically unpalatable.
Sure.
And so pharma companies have to wrestle with that.
They're then attaching this obligation to themselves if they go down this route.
Obligation. Like I think, my preference would be, and there's companies that do this that I think are doing the right thing. If you're doing trials in emerging markets, you should plan on at least making the products available in the markets and communities that you trialed the drug in, and that is not always.
I mean, this sort of does seem like the wholesome, natural thing to do. If the counterfactual is not going there at all, it's not clear that anyone is better off for that. You have brought jobs, you have brought development, you have brought industry to it, even if you sort of then turn the cold shoulder. Nevertheless, like pragmatically getting involved, you get entangled and then you feel like you have to do this thing and you just wouldn't start.
I think they're just very risk averse. And,
Sure.
and so clinical trials and drug development is risky to begin with and has like low the probability of technical success. And so it's like, you're starting out before getting into phase 1 clinical trials, you have your IND, the likelihood you get a drug is like, let's say 20% or something. If that 20% is impacted by 1%, that's like a 5% delta.
Sure.
Like in absolute percentage, like you're really just like impairing, and from the model standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then there's like this kind of intangible fear of like new. Yeah, and I think there's just
even in cases where like the natural thing to be afraid of is the regulator, but the regulator sometimes is welcoming these things. Like the FDA has things that it asks for industry to do that I see not happening.
And there's kind of like the diffuse ask and the incentives to respond to that ask, and who's actually responsible. So I have a view on, there's like a little bit of that going on, I think, where like who is industry and does an individual CEO or an individual head of oncology have like is able to respond to that kind of in a coordinated way. So there's like it's a bunch of weird stuff, I think, in that direction. Yeah, it's interesting. It's like so much of what we do is by its very nature in these markets, right? Like we have to run the trials in these markets, that it's like not something that we end up kind of going to the mat on very often. It's either just going to be run in the US because that's the way it's always been done, and that was the plan when we got on board with the company, or it's like a special situation where we're going to, it's going to be in the emerging markets because that's where the disease is.
Sure.
Yeah.
And maybe this is getting a little bit out of your bailiwick. Are we seeing more move towards the ex-US trials on that commercial side? sort of outside of we're forced because of the nature of our indication? Are we seeing more of these elective ex-US trials after 2020? And
yeah, probably in aggregate after 2020, because so much of this was like global COVID trials. I think it'll be interesting to see how that returns. It also depends on what we mean by global, because if we include China and India in this, then yes, because these are, China in particular is booming.
Plenty of trials are happening in China of drugs that were developed in China and never touched the lab.
It's a remarkable story. There's, a story a couple of weeks ago looking at 2023, 2024 in licensing from China, and it's like 30% of US in licensing deals were from Chinese companies in 23, 24, which is remarkable, up from like 0% essentially a decade ago. China, when I got started in this business, first of all, the CFDA was essentially non-functional at the time. China was seen as this market you launch products into.
Sure.
At some point, this is kind of an expected curve of a country that's developing this like robust and quite impressive research and development ecosystem, and has emphasized this as a priority from the top. You saw companies.
Even then, it was a manufacturing center.
It was manufacturing center
pharmaceutical.
for pharmaceuticals, and remains a huge manufacturing center for pharmaceuticals. And oftentimes you see this kind of, I'm just doing contract manufacturing, shift quite quickly into we're actually building the higher value products. You see this like kind of across industries, but China certainly has had this happen where they were very good at making things cheaply and well. And now have a world-class research establishment and, biopharmaceutical complex that is generating like real discoveries in a variety of disease areas and licensing them out to the US, which I think would have been unthinkable 10 years ago at the scale. And so I think that's very exciting from a public health standpoint.
Why is that?
I mean, I am just excited to have other kind of a non-unipolar. I mean, Europe has been an important part of the biopharmaceutical kind of research industrial complex, but from a drug development and commercialization standpoint, but from a launching products into the world standpoint over the past 20 or so years, the US has been completely dominant. And so I think just as a public health person, I like more minds on task and more dollars going towards drug development. And it's pretty clear that China has like a remarkable kind of university and industrial biotech sector. And I'm kind of happy to see that start happening. I think there's a lot of like political overlay here around like, what does that mean for us? Just kind of like China tech versus US tech in general being an issue. But if I'm thinking about this as a patient and a public health person, it's hard for me to imagine more R&D dollars going into these spaces and more innovations happening, not being like net good, even if we have to bring them in and deploy them ourselves partially. I think it would be hard for me to get upset about new vaccines being developed in another country that hadn't previously developed them themselves.
As a patient and as a
patient and as someone who wants fewer kids to die, I think, so I think I'm like, obviously Asia, Korea and Japan have often punched above their weight from like a GDP and population standpoint in terms of like public health, and whether it's international aid or just like R&D in public health. And it's just great to see like another country on the map doing that.
If you then bracket out the case of China, which is sort of on its own development arc, and you say ex-US, ex-China, what's happening to places where people weren't necessarily doing research, but the trials that are coming from these multinationals are thinking about taking trials to places like Sub-Saharan Africa, LATAM, Southeast Asia?
One of the reasons it's expensive to recruit patients in the US, like let's take oncology, is, the sub-slice of the market concept where, in order to enter the market with an oncology drug, you typically start with either a type of cancer that is completely unaddressed today, which there are vanishingly few of those that have no kind of first line treatment, or you're coming in like fifth or sixth line. You're trying to basically find a subsegment of the population that is currently unaddressed and kind of address that, and then kind of keep moving up until you get to the general population of that cancer subtype. And so what that means is very long development timelines, difficulty marketing a product in the early years, difficulty even recruiting patients for these trials.
You need the patients who've watched out of the first 4 lines to run a 5th line trial.
With caveats, but essentially, and in emerging markets and even in kind of like middle income countries, you have these treatment naive populations. And so I think for that type of thing, you do have this nice setup where you can actually bring care to people who are otherwise not going to receive care with an experimental drug. I only know this because I have friends who work in kind of global oncology space, and the kind of health systems, doctor training, changing protocols is non-trivial. So yeah, I think I see some of that happening in our world. We're just so used to dealing with these countries, and in some cases, in the case of HIV in South Africa, these are the centers of excellence for this. Clinical trial, running HIV clinical trials in South Africa. It's kind of as good as it gets. And so, and India on the vaccine manufacturing side, there's
some spillovers here. I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa has relatively robust genomic sequencing labs and technology and sort of experience from their work with retrovirals, which I imagine is a perhaps unexpected asset resource going into oncology, because this is then the thing you're doing. And
first one to say it's like ubiquitous, but in hospitals,
sure.
So many people live outside of and nowhere close to even a medical center, and so there's that problem. But
at the medical centers,
there's a bunch of examples of this, like TB and this type of PCR test for TB. Now all these clinics and hospitals have this TB box, this box that can be used for other things. Bunch of great examples of that. Yeah, training is kind of this intangible asset that you get when you're dealing with any of these, equipment and training. And then, I think COVID similarly, you had this kind of infusion of capital into diagnosis,
and interest and political will and
the whole thing. And on the manufacturing side, which is really important, I think billions of dollars went into setting up kind of pandemic response, mRNA manufacturing hubs across Sub-Saharan Africa. And the idea anyway is that they will produce medicines licensed from, Western or Eastern partners,
but with some continental sovereignty.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. I think because, as we saw in the pandemic, things go a little crazy and people get pretty nationalistic.
Put on their own oxygen mask first.
Yeah, totally. And so I think there's, that's kind of an interesting thing to follow.
So as we're seeing the global landscape of disease sort of become increasingly one game board, in the sort of company strategies that you've been discussing, all of this stuff still goes through the FDA as the sort of regulatory checkpoint. Does the FDA do an acceptable job of evaluating medications where the use case, the medical context, the standard of care is somewhere else, and it perhaps makes sense on the margin in those markets, even if it falls behind what might be widely available in the U.S.? Can the FDA make reasonable decisions about medicines in Africa and Latin America?
That's a really great question. So I mean, something that is well addressed here in the U.S., the bar for a new treatment in that space is should be understandably high.
There were cases of this in COVID where repurposed drugs coming up for evaluation for emergency use at the FDA, for which some of the response was, these don't meet the standard of Paxlovid, of the specialty developed drugs, and we can't approve them on an emergency basis for that regard, notwithstanding that there are many, sort of a large portion of the 96% of the world didn't have access to these first-line drugs from Pfizer, and then just sort of no regulator got to an answer on whether these repurposed things were correct, because there are many systems that are used to deferring to the decisions of the FDA.
Yeah, it's a great example, because the FDA basically has asked the question, is this an improvement over the standard of care?
And they had the right answer.
And they had the right answer for that narrow question. We don't have a regulatory authority. We have other mechanisms. There's this concept of WHO PQ, which is really just, how do we get a US FDA approval or an EMA approval and bring it
exported to other places?
Yeah, we don't really have this idea of a US based, top tier regulator or CFDA or EMA
with the global view.
Looks like the global view. I think it is considered, but it really is not the remit of the. And so, I think it is a huge problem in, access, during pandemics is, there's lots of things that would have been helpful, but that were not better than the antibodies and were not better than Paxlovid.
Yeah.
And so, you have this issue where there's actually not an authority in the world who's kind of tasked with this. It's a really interesting question. I haven't heard robust proposals for solving this, apart from, spinning up a unit within the FDA or having an independent regulator for the world.
Yeah. You hear some interest in this coming out of the African Union, which is, I think, one of the
FDA kind of concept.
Or sort of under Africa CDC, that there's this sense that, perhaps these systems aren't working well, and perhaps there is a sort of political body that is sort of large enough to do something about it, that the sort of 1.3 billion people, in fact, that's the size at which this perhaps can get addressed. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it plays.
I think it's a cool idea. I mean, like CFDA is maybe a good example. China FDA of taking a regulator that wasn't kind of,
they were used to deferring.
Yeah, and it wasn't a globally recognized regulator, and now it is a very good, by all accounts, regulator. It's been tricky. I mean, I have a little bit of experience with this in Africa, just around regulatory harmonization. Because even now, if you get a drug or device approved by FDA or EMA, we talked about WHIC, which really relates to like the UN organizations and procurement. Some countries kind of recognize versions of that for approval internally, but oftentimes you have to go country by country. There's something, I think it's called like the East African Regulatory Harmonization Regime, that several countries got together and said, hey, if your FDA approves something, my FDA will like kind of give it the thumbs up, like a light review, which is how it typically works from the FDA. But even that, we don't have a kind of global approval. We don't have a regional approval. And so as it stands today, in most cases, every country has to do their own evaluation. Oftentimes they're looking at an FDA or EMA dossier and approving, but like it's non-trivial. Like it's thousands of pages.
You still have to read.
You still have to read the documents. And so I think that's a really cool idea.
I guess just opening it up. What's next for you? And what's next for global health?
What's next for me? So I'm busy at GHIC trying to find opportunities in global health and health security. So if anyone listening is interested in or working on a project in that space, I'd love to hear about it.
Are we in a brave new world after 2020? Like what's changed?
Yeah, so I think there was some irrational exuberance in 2020 and 2021 around vaccines, and you saw a lot of infectious disease companies and vaccine companies.
There are 20 people racing to get a COVID vaccine, and everyone wanted to try a second one.
I thought it was a remarkable response from the public health and technology community. So I'm just like very proud to have even seen that, been a part of that.
Irrational exuberance is not exactly a dirty world. Dirty world,
especially in a world. Those kind of weird tail risk scenarios. It's like, I want people to be irrational on the problem side. I think you've seen some reversion because so many firms and companies got burned during COVID. So you've seen kind of almost like a reversion to numbers below pre-pandemic numbers in terms of investment in the space. I do think I'm optimistic. I think I am kind of feeling very cautious moving forward around like what role the federal government will play in research and development. But for the time being, I think it's safe to assume that like the private sector, along with foundations, are on its own. There are some kind of upshots. Maybe this becomes a less unipolar global health research and development world. So whether it's China or the European Union, or
you're just moving from a federal model out to a
more distributed model. But I think it could be good to have a more kind of federated, distributed model for R&D in terms of funding and hopefully bringing in stakeholders that were not traditionally represented. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, AI is this like kind of orthogonal thing coming at all of us in terms of, not something we've ever thought about before 2 or 3 years ago, but could really be interesting in a number of ways. And this is kind of a well-worn topic, but significantly lowering the cost of drug discovery, kind of synthetic assays, being able to kind of model animals and organs in AI so that you're actually reducing the cost of kind of preclinical development or even
getting that success rate above 10%.
Yeah, the success rate, like in so many ways, predictive modeling, I think and those are just like tools in kind of like AI 1.0. We're not even talking about AGI or anything.
Automated researchers and
all of that. But just even these tools, like which have been around for a while, but have been
pipe.
Exactly. It's like it's actually happening, and so I think that's pretty cool. I mean, people have been talking to us about AI, clinical trial recruitment, drug discovery, AI, modeling of organs and organoids and systems for years. They just weren't contributing meaningfully to like the GDP of biopharma. And I think that's just got to change in the next 5 years based on what I'm seeing in the papers I'm reading. So I actually am like excited about that. I also think that plays into the kind of federated science piece because of like the marginal cost, I mean, depending on how you think about it, of just, delivering like a model or one of these technologies is so low. So like so much of the upfront cost is going to be developing these tools. And if we're talking about kind of a distributed R&D ecosystem, whether it's funding or doing the work, having software tools as opposed to like wet lab and like manufacturing be the kind of bottleneck is kind of an interesting paradigm. So I'm excited about that. And I mean, I view that what we do and kind of what you're interested in and the people you've had on your podcast, it's never been more important to do this. I think, pandemics are quite scary. We're dealing with this H5 situation now. Infectious disease isn't going away anytime soon. chronic disease is getting worse, that there's so much to do in this space. And it's a really exciting time to be kind of in the public health R&D world. And yeah, we're very busy.
Charlie Petty, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
We've brought together an incredible group of people who are leaders in their fields. Each are coming at this from a different perspective, but the thing that unifies them is that they believe that something can be done differently, and they're doing it.
We think we can cut this Gordian knot.
To do it smarter and better.
Our equipment is even cheaper to grow.
Been brewing beer.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Giving biotechs the ability to think and act more like tech companies.
These conversations are laying out the pieces of the puzzle.
The market is willing to pay for some of these premium vaccines.
Turn down the dial on the immune system that's causing it to go haywire.
We should be looking back and saying chemotherapy was barbaric.
We have an opportunity to unlock a better, healthier world.
This is not a zero-sum game.
This is Development and Research, an interview series about fixing the broken world of clinical trials.